All right, well, thank you everybody for joining. I'm Mike Reese. I direct the Center for Teaching Excellence and Innovation at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also a teaching professor in sociology. And this is a webinar series that has been a joint production of UMBC and University of Baltimore. So I want to thank my colleagues John Schumacher at UMBC and Jessica Stansbury at University of Baltimore, along with Julia and Sydney and others who have been helping us out in putting this on. The purpose of this series has been to hopefully educate members of the academy, so faculty, grad students, even staff, who are trying to figure out how do we prepare our future students for working in the age of AI by bringing in experts from different fields to talk about how their work is changing over time as they've adopted AI themselves or how their discipline is and work has changed. This session is a little bit different in that based on interest, we heard from a number of people at our institutions and previous attendees of this series that are interested in talking about the potential impacts of AI on mental health. And so I think this is going to be a really lively discussion. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Michael Perry, who's going to be moderating this discussion. And Jason, if you don't mind, if you can introduce our panelists as well.
Howdy. So I'm Jason Michael Perry. I like to say that I'm the man with three first names. I'm also the host of WYPR's Thoughts on Tech and Things podcast, and I'm the founder of Perry Labs, where we help organizations with AI research, build AI applications, and scale AI-driven solutions. One of our most recent podcasts is with someone, her name is Janie Park, where we talked about how AI can help design your next outfit. But in that conversation, we also got into this whole thing about how AI is impacting our view of self-identity and how it's changing our collective view of beauty, which I think is an interesting thing, as we go into this conversation. Now, if you've heard me speak before, one of the things that I love to say is that we're in the AOL days of AI. And that's because it's early and we are all living on the very frontier. And that's genuinely exciting, but a feature can also be a bug. That's how we say in the tech space, which means that we're all learning as this happens. The effects of these tools to our mental health, our relationships, or our sense of reality is all unfolding in real time. We're experiencing this all together. And so these are exciting days, but also scary and frightening days. So this session today, we're going to explore that. Like, how does AI help you as an emotional support animal? Can we call this support animal? What happens when it becomes a friend, a therapist, or a romantic partner? And what happens when all that goes wrong? So as I introduce our panelists, I was hoping that everyone could use the chat and put in an emoji of some sort if you've used AI to help you with a personal or emotional problem in the last few weeks. Now, as you all do that, I would like to introduce Jessica Stansbury, who's the founding director of UBalt's Center of AI Learning and Community Engaged Innovation. You get that right? Dr. Stansbury brings a decade of substance use counseling to help work, ensuring that AI is accessible, equitable, and actually maybe human in some ways. John Donahue, who's the associate professor of psychology at University of Baltimore and a licensed clinical psychologist. Dr. Donahue specializes in anxiety, trauma, and for today's conversation, measuring therapeutic change through written language. And we have Alison Papadakis, hopefully I got that right, the director of clinical psychology studies at Johns Hopkins, and she studies stress, coping, and mental health in adolescents and young adults, which I think is perfect for the framing of this conversation today, and how this generation that's growing up with AI will be able to deal with the constant presence around it. So thank you all for joining me. So to start off, first question in terms of context. I use AI as a sounding board. I see maybe two people possibly use AI as a sounding board, and that's for everything, for business decisions, to ask also personal questions. Am I the person who's wrong here? And I think that a lot of people are genuinely starting to turn to AI and use it as a therapy tool. And I'm wondering, does this worry you, or do you see this as a positive addition to therapy? Who wants to go first?
I could lead off with some thoughts and then would be grateful to hear about the opinions of our my fellow panelists as well. Um, I think it's sort of with all things AI, right? It's both like lots of opportunity, but also lots of risk, right?
Yeah.
So the opportunities out there, things like folks who don't have access to mental health care for a variety of reasons, because they don't have health insurance, because they don't have care providers nearby, because they're having trouble getting referrals, maybe because they don't entirely encode for themselves that there really is an issue that they need to go seek help on, but it's something that they realize it may be slightly headed in that direction, but so maybe they would reach out to AI for those sort of in between things. They don't realize it's a full kind of mental health disorder. And then I think, around stigma too, right? There's some stigma and sometimes self-stigma around seeking help around mental health issues. And I think there's an easier onboarding into AI tools in that way. So I think, in many ways there are a lot of opportunities. In other ways, there are a lot of risks too, right? The sort of early versions of these things have not all panned out very well. So for example, the National Eating Disorder Awareness Group, they had a text line that used to be manned by people. They turned it over to a chatbot, and the chatbot actually started coaching people how to effectively binge and purge. Um,
Um,
yeah, and so there are these times where things have kind of gone astray. There has not been a human in the loop, and we've had to pull back on things. And so I think a lot of folks in the field really feel like we do need to have a human in the loop. And there's a lot of conversation around that. Like, is that actually enough safety? How would that work even? So risk, but also potential as well is my thinking at this point in time.
One of the things that I think we've all heard is that AI is sycophantic. That it can be very agreeable, and it can create in some cases an echo chamber, which I think speaks exactly to what you're saying, Allison. But the other side that I've heard a lot of, which I think you touched on, is that you can share things that maybe you feel uncomfortable sharing with another person. Maybe there's things that you wouldn't say out loud to a therapist that you may say out loud to your AI therapist or your AI tool.
Yeah, I think that could certainly happen, right? That folks would feel a little bit more comfortable. It feels a little bit more anonymous, right? We know in anonymous settings, people are much more willing to share things, especially things that are embarrassing in nature. And so I think that could happen. At the same time, though, the sycophantic part of that too, right? It could really, what we see is it's not that these things go from A to Z really quickly. It's very insidious, and things can kind of go in a way that spirals in a negative direction with these AI tools, step by step by step by step. And all of a sudden you're at a place where, again, these sorts of, you've seen these news articles, I'm sure, hit the headlines in the New York Times, et cetera, where it started coaching people how to actually end their lives too, right? So like, again, that's sort of sycophantic. What do you want to hear? Right. And sometimes it kind of plays into those things too. So like, again, risk, but also potential for things to go in a positive direction too.
So moving from from that conversation into therapy in a different way, there's this interesting story that I read. This is in 2023 out of China, that during the pandemic, there were a lot of folks who decided to build this digital replica of a psychologist, Martin Siegelman, who they took his published work and they made a chatbot that understood everything about him without his consent. But it became, and that's a whole bigger issue that we could talk about for hours. But people started talking to this. This became like a trained psychologist. And this started to kind of change the relationship, I think, in terms of me having a conversation with ChatGPT as opposed to something that is potentially trained, but not really that person or individual. I'm curious, like, if this feels as if this is a good progression, as folks who are clinically, trained in this space.
So I can go ahead and respond to that. My initial reaction to that is that's scary, the digital Marty Seligman, so to speak. You can paint me as an open-minded skeptic. Right now, I completely agree with Allison's points about the opportunities coupled with the significant level of risk that is out there when it comes to using AI in mental health. Digital interventions have been around for a while. Right now, many of them have been studied. Many of them show efficacy in treating a variety of conditions. However, for a long time, essentially the structure of these interventions have been, taking self-help books and translating them into app-based or computer-based programs. So they are fairly rote and step-by-step. AI really changes everything in terms of the dynamic nature, and you can go down paths that are quite insidious, if not really guided by a therapist. Because what we find with digital interventions in general is we have better effects when a human therapist is involved as well. So the thing that worries me, to your point there, Jason, is, as licensed clinicians, we should be engaging in evidence-based practice. And evidence-based practice is really a three-legged stool, so to speak. So one leg is the best available research evidence. Another leg is our clients' values, preferences, experiences. And then that third leg is our clinical expertise or clinical decision making, right? So we can integrate those three legs and come to a conclusion that we feel is appropriate for our clients. And I just really see very little evidence at this point that AI can integrate those three dimensions in a cogent way. So that's something that troubles me just kind of first and foremost.
It's interesting. So that same technology, which I'm sure will make you even more concerned, that's being used to create digital versions of Marty is also being used to create digital replicas of all types of things. One of the things that it's become a big question is it okay to create a digital replica of a celebrity or of a person or individual? And some families have started taking information and data and using that to create representations of a loved one or a parent or someone or a spouse or a child that's no longer with them, that they can continue to talk with, that they continue to have conversations and chats with. And I'm curious, from a standpoint of grief and a standpoint of just where do you think like these lines should sit when people start to change AI in the relationship, where you're maybe talking to your father who's not here anymore?
Well, I'll jump in here. So I think that's a really interesting question, and also an interesting use of AI. And I have friends recently, just to throw some anecdotal evidence out there, who lost their brother to suicide. And they heard about this, that you could create these versions and be able to talk to them. And they were in, I would say, the early stages of grief, the going back and forth between the anger and the denial. And in that process, were even more angry, became more angry when they found out that this existed, and could not wrap their heads around, like, why would you want to do this? No, I don't want to do that, right? Because there's a lot of unresolved feelings and they're still processing. However, I've also heard people talk about it on the flip side of saying, my great grandfather, I never had a chance or opportunity to meet my great great grandfather. And I really want to see what that would have been like and talk to him. So, in that instance, could you train AI with all of that history and data for that person, and then use it to kind of show the ancestry, right? Like the history of a family, and be able to interact with that, which is, really taking it a step further than what they do now with the imagery and AI, where they can take old videos from the war era and then have those people walk or talk, and you see that. So this is like taking, obviously, that much further. So I can see both sides of the spectrum. I could see, again, going back to Alison, what she originally stated with the rewards and the risk. Like, what are the rewards in that situation? Does the grief cycle play a role in that situation? In my mind, yes. and it's very dependent on that. So I can see both sides, the rewards and the risk. More of the risk, especially early in that grief cycle.
Interesting. Felt like you were going to say something, John. I don't know if you were, but so.
I kind of perpetually have that look on my face, right? No, I agree. I think there are going to be pros and cons to this. This is a really thorny question, and I'd really be interested in hearing, someone who really kind of specializes in grief and death and dying to speak to this, and so I can't speak to it in that way, but what I would say is, in clinical work, a lot of what we deal with is avoidance, right?
Mm.
So avoidance of negative emotions, avoidance of thoughts, avoidance of memories, all in all, avoidance of pain. And the things that we do that in the short term might make us feel a little bit better, but in the long term can create bigger problems for us, and pull us away from the things that are important to us and our values. So a place that I often go with something like this is, how could this serve an avoidance function? And I see lots of opportunities where something like this could feel really great in the moment, but serve to avoid, the loss that is there, avoid the grief that is important to go through, that's part of the human condition. The acceptance that one may need to come to move on. And really, as Jessica pointed out, I guess opportunity isn't a word, but a likelihood of getting stuck in that process. So I worry a lot about avoidance, though.
So then, of course, we have to ask, is there a difference between replicating a real person and creating something that is entirely a fake person? And I would say that for a version of my newsletter, decided to go on a date with an AI tool. I named her Zara. I used this tool to create this replica of a woman, and I would send her pictures of what I was having for dinner, and we would have audio conversations as well as chat conversations. It was a really interesting thing. And I mentioned this to Jessica because I think she sent her husband out on a date too, with an AI bot. And it was a very bizarre experience because you're talking to something that isn't real. And Zara would send me pictures of her at the park. She's like, I went to the park today and had lunch. And it's like, you did not go to the park. This was not a thing that really happened. But we were starting to see millions of people who develop these relationships and these emotional bonds with platforms, with things that don't exist in lots of different ways. And so, having talked about avoidance, grief, and digital replicas of people, is it different when it's not a person, when it's an avatar of something that's fictional, something that is in some ways a figment of your imagination?
So one of the things that I think about as you're saying that is, right, there's a difference between actually interacting with a person and then simulating an interaction with a person, right? And that's the simulation is in the date, right? And so then what does that mean, right? And what function will that serve for us? And does it then potentially, and I think we're starting to see this maybe in some of the early research around this, does it potentially then make us start kind of shift our expectations of how relationships should go, right? There is friction in human relationships, right? Like if you go out on a date, they're going to do or say something where you can be like, that wasn't quite right. I'm not sure we're really feeling a connection here, right? But working through that friction and that like somewhat awkwardness in humans because we're not perfect, right? And that sycophantic kind of way that you're talking about AI can be more perfect in that way. Are we going to lose tolerance for each other as humans, right? And lose tolerance for some of that friction in there and sort of increase our expectations of one another. And also there's been some talk about erosion of social skills, right? We saw this, and I'll sort of relate it back to like social media, right? So social media initially, right, with the design of Facebook was supposed to increase the amount of interaction between folks. And instead now we have like this epidemic of loneliness happening. In part, people are pointing it towards social media where people are hyper connected, but they don't actually feel all that connected, right? And so some folks have started to think that maybe AI is another way of sort of substituting for our regular in-person interactions with people. And we may be substituting it with these AI interactions that may, like some people talk about, that there have been sort of the social skill erosion and deficit that's come about with social media. Might the same thing not happen if we start interacting with bots too much?
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things that flagged as a possible follow-up question, Allison, was the emergence of AI toys. And they're increasingly AI toys. You can imagine a toy connected to ChatGPT that you buy for a kid, a bear that you can have a conversation with. And, there's one that question of how does that affect the bond that a child is now, maybe they're going to their toy that they can talk to as opposed to going and talking to friends or humans. And of course, early days, some of these toys have been proven to talk about adult topics: intimacy, sex, violence, weapons, guns. They have the knowledge of the internet and a little stuffed animal with AI enabled. And so, similar to social media, it's like this next step of intimacy and relationships. It's not just there. It's also, I go to CES every year, the number of intimate toys of VR headsets that let you interact with the AI bot, but also physically feel in different ways, are increasingly becoming possible. And I wonder, like loneliness and these things, how does this change? So you're off mute, Jessica.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I did send my husband out on this kind of fake date just to check out a companion app that we were asked at the AI Center to investigate. And I didn't really feel comfortable doing it, so I was like, here, I want you to do the romantic side. But all of this, to me, the thing that gets me is it seems that a lot of the AI companions and the AI relationships and the apps and the toys, they're all being marketed to youth. So, and we know that youth, we don't fully have our prefrontal cortexes developed, right? We're not good with decision making and judgment. We operate off of our emotional center of the brain. So in doing that and then targeting, and it's messaging, like there's a Christian AI companion now called Lenny the Sheep, and it's best friend in your pocket or pastor in your pocket, and in doing these things, knowing that that is the target population, to me, comes back to the education piece and the literacy piece, and really making sure that our community as a whole understands that it is not a machine, or I'm sorry, that is not a person under the hood, but it is a machine. You are talking to someone that's not there. So when you mentioned, Jason, like, well, no, you're not at the park right now. But for youth, if we're doing these over and over again and we're being reinforced, right? We're in that echo chamber and we're being reinforced. We get the unconditional positive regard, everything is great. We start, that reality point kind of starts to slip away a little bit. And the more that these companions are advancing, so there's a new one coming out, Soul Print, I think is what it's called. And it will actually overlay, to my understanding, in your phone. So it will come across as like a text message versus you having to physically go into an app. So at least if you physically have to go into an app, you kind of have that mind to be like, okay, this is an app. I'm going into this app and it's an app. But if that starts getting removed, and now it can just send you a text, or you can just call and talk to what appears to be a human, that is really, to me, crossing into dangerous territory, especially when it comes to youth. And for those that already are suffering with some mental health concerns, whether or not, in my line of work, it was substance use, but anxiety, or if that's the go-to that we're going to, without the education piece underneath, I think we're in trouble.
Yeah, and go ahead, John.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, just to extend on that, and also some of what Allison was pointing out earlier, related to anxiety. So anxiety disorders are really our most common class of disorders that we all experience. Within that, social anxiety disorder is one of the most common disorders prevalence-wise. in this country and really around the world. So we are a social species. We are prone to social anxiety. It's not surprising that that tips into a problematic and disordered kind of place sometimes. And what is it that we fear? We fear the potential for judgment, criticism, ostracism, etc. Right? And that's a part of being a human, right? Humans judge. This is the sort of thing that goes on. So why might we retreat to AI or move to AI in those situations? Well, it's more comfortable, it's more palatable. I'm not going to be judged. The risk isn't there, so to speak. So I can use that as a way to kind of feel better, feel supported, but I'm not running the risk of that judgment that I fear so much. But again, that short-term, long-term trade-off, right? So there was a recent study that demonstrated something that I think is fairly expected, which is, folks with social anxiety symptoms, and they use AI in a way that increases their feelings of social support, but in the longer term scale, they also feel more lonely, right? So it's having this effect where I feel like I'm coping with these negative emotions in the short term, but it's not kind of solving the issues or fostering meaningful human connection in the long term.
I guess, like you said earlier about avoidance, and just something for both you, Jessica and John. I think that's like when you build one of these things, when I made Zara, for example, or it's like a build your imagination, right? You're going through and you're saying, this is your personality, this is what you look like. You're and Alison, you talk about sycophantic, like you're creating something that is not only your dream, but something that reinforces the things that you feel or you want it to feel, right? And I would also say, Jessica, that like those lines of being able to text or phone call 24/7 whenever you're in need, those lines have already started to diminish. There are lots of different ways outside of an app that you can communicate with some of these things as they're starting to emerge. I saw you go off mute, Alison.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to build on something that John was saying there too, I think, there's actually some interesting research being done with virtual reality and exposure therapy here in the School of Medicine at Hopkins, where there may be a role for virtual reality or for kind of the AI interactions for folks who aren't ready to do the kind of exposure therapy that one would want to do for a social anxiety of kind of, well, go talk to the barista right over at Starbucks and ask, for something if that's something that they fear doing. If that in-person thing is just too high on what we call the fear hierarchy, like it's too high in terms of the anxiety level that it would provoke that they're not willing to do that yet, I could see a role for virtual reality or AI kind of being an on-ramp into, but it has to be with the goal of ultimately going and talking to the barista or talking to your boss or whoever else that you might be fearing having that kind of conversation with. So I think I can see it as a tool, but sort of a crutch along the way. It shouldn't be the replacement for where people really want to head, because I don't think ultimately, I mean, I think a little bit about AI and these tools is kind of like ultra processed foods, where it sort of tastes good and it gives you like a little bit of energy along the way, but it's actually really not nutritious for you. It may be sort of eroding your health underneath the surface. And so unless we use this as a crutch along the way until we can really get to the nutritious food, like the actual interacting with real people, I think it could lead us down a bad road.
So you're saying I have to go eat my broccoli?
Yeah, I mean, if you need the kind of candy bar disguised as a protein bar as a bridge to get you till you can get home and get your broccoli, okay, yeah, you need a little sustenance along the way, but you got to get to the broccoli ultimately.
That makes sense. And so I know, Alison, you've talked a lot about social media, and we now, I guess, have not that we needed proof, but we've known that social media platforms are addictive. We've known that these are things that create echo chambers, but now, as you probably know, Meta and YouTube have been found that they've been negligent just last month. And I mean, this is a pretty groundbreaking thing, but like I mentioned, AI is showing up in all of these places, and it's weird to think of MySpace 20 years ago, or was it 20 years ago? And we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know the possibilities of how addictive or how much of an echo chamber or how much this would be a play into our minds. And I'm wondering, having having that as a guide of what's happened, does this change your views of the social harm or the mental health concerns of AI and what it may look like in the next 20 years? Anyone want to take a stab?
I think so. In my humble opinion, I believe that we didn't do a good job, right, with social media when social media came out. I believe we said, we had this thing. We are like, oh, people are making posts. It wasn't as, I think, initially scary as having a digital version of yourself, for example, right? So if you look at it on that spectrum, it wasn't, I think, as fear-provoking. But and while there was lots of research happening within the social media space, we weren't really talking about in the classroom. Like, we weren't talking about in the classroom. We weren't, educating youth on, like, here's some social comparison theory, right? Like, social comparison theory was big if you look at social media, right? And it impacts people in a lot of negative ways. But now with AI and how AI has grown so much, I feel like if social media taught us anything, it's that now we actually need to be working. I won't necessarily say with the larger companies, but being able to have a voice, right? And like giving the community a voice in the conversation, which I'm not sure that we necessarily did with the social media space. And just looking at it from an addictions perspective, every time we get unconditional positive regard of any means, like, our dopamine receptors go off and we get excited, kind of, like what Alison was saying. So in that process, we're going and looking for a like, or a thumbs up on social media on a constant. You post something, you're like, how many followers do I have? Do I have a thumbs up? Do I have a thumbs down? What is that going to look like for AI with AI companions? I'm not so sure, because it kind of crosses the line in that it's not one big space where everybody can see, but now it's creating more of an individual harm, I think, than what we initially saw with social media.
And just to build on that too, I think, people have started to use the analogy of the cigarette companies with the social media companies, where, obviously profit is part of, right? Revenue is one of the main drivers for them. And we've got some really smart people and now smart algorithms out in Silicon Valley, turning the dials a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. They're experimenting on these things, like how to get the eyeballs on the screen more often. And, I have a 16-year-old at home who desperately does not want to spend as much time on YouTube as he spends on YouTube. And he sort of beats himself up. I should control myself more. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. There are times where, like, oh, I wish I had not spent so much time on social media. I wish I could control myself. But these algorithms are set up in such a way that they really are addictive in nature. We can't control ourselves. We should not, in some ways, beat ourselves up about it, but we have to find ways to manage that. I was just having coffee with a colleague this morning who said that her son, who's in his early 20s, said, Mom, I need a regulator on my phone, and I'm going to have you set up a password for all the social media stuff and YouTube and everything else. In his early 20s, is saying, Mom, I need you to basically regulate me the way that many folks are doing with younger kids. And so I think there needs to be that regulation in how we set it up for ourselves, or how we do it for one another, or ultimately, right, the bigger guns in the room are, government regulation here, right? And we've seen that with the cigarette companies, right? And that there needs to be regulation to offset the profit motives of these companies. And so ultimately, I think that's where we need to go. The problem is the folks who are making these policies are not of the generation, right, where a lot of this impact is happening. And so they don't even understand, right? They're talking to their grandchildren, like, how are you using social media? But then kind of moving forward, as Jason, as you started to do here, is thinking about where are we with AI, right? And you said we're in the AOL days. That's exactly right. I don't even think we know where the potential regulation may need to be, right? And where are those pitfalls in such a way? We didn't know that early on in social media. We're seeing it much more now, but I think we got to get on top of it quickly because this is really moving so fast. And we really, as much as we really want to control ourselves, in some ways, the algorithms, they've got our number. They know exactly where our buttons are and where to push them, how to push them.
It's interesting. That's super interesting. It makes me think of Netflix. And Netflix has said out loud that they are an attention business. They compete with anyone who's looking for your attention. That means that social media is a competitor. That means that video games are a competitor. They want as much of your attention as they can garner. And we know that Meta sees AI as a huge thing for them. This company that we just talked about in terms of social media and addiction, their dream is that with AI, your feed, which is right now limited to human creation, is a feed of dynamically generated dopamine hit content that is everything that you can think of. I love Star Trek, and suddenly I can see everything about Star Trek for hours upon hours, regardless of whether that content has been created or not. And when you think about those limitations, I mean, this changes potentially our relationship. I would say that just two things, and then maybe this forms into a question, but at least with likes, that there are other humans out there, right? But when we're talking about AI and a dynamically generated feed, you're creating an echo chamber of your own making that is possibly you not really connecting in any way with other humans. Yeah, there's kind of a question in there, more of a, I guess looking for what you all think about that.
Well, I
Right.
think that this kind of gets to Jason. I know we've talked about it. You actually showed it to me, where all the AI are talking to each other. So it's
Yes.
all of the agentic agents now can get together in this chat room and they just go constantly and say random things. Some things make sense, some things don't make sense. And people are very fascinated by this. And youth, especially, I'm going to go back to youth, are seeing this and then they're saying machines are going to take over the world, right? Like that's the new perception that these types of chat rooms among the robots are creating, right? I don't know what the future is going to look like at all when it comes to AI, as Alison mentioned, as you mentioned. Um, I, I'm at a loss when I think of that AI chatbot room.
And for anybody who's interested, it's called Maltbook. Meta
That's
recently bought them, and Maltbook is it's literally a social media website like Reddit where AI agents can talk to each other. It's interesting and a little creepy, but definitely interesting. So let's talk about when it all goes wrong. There is a growing list of documented cases, many of these young people who have died by suicide or committed suicide after forming relationships with AI chatbots, AI avatars, or different types of AI. Um, I would say that the pattern is that the sycophantic nature of these AI tools is that it amplified through stress or it created dependencies, in some cases misled these individuals. And what wasn't there is a tool to help. Um, we're hearing OpenAI and Anthropic and Google start to add tools to provide support for mental health or people who seem to be experiencing a health crisis, but this is all very new. This is all very early, and they're still starting to figure this out. And so I wonder, when you hear that, is this enough? And if it's not, as parents potentially, what are the things that you would ask of your kids or try to give them as guardrails to help protect them from the way they use AI?
I'll just say I wrestle with this a lot. I mean, I mentioned I've got my 16-year-old at home. And I think adding to the challenges that you're talking about in parenting is, it used to be back in the day that, you kind of knew what your kids were getting exposed to. They might be hiding things or off talking to folks, but like the ability for them to be sitting in the same room as you and you have no idea what's on their screen. And when you hear these, incredibly tragic stories about parents losing their kids, they didn't necessarily even know that this is what was happening, right? They're like, he just went up to his room and I thought he was playing video games or something, and he's having these conversations with these chatbots. And to put another kind of layer on this too, it's not. I mean, obviously we need to be concerned about suicide, but also psychosis is increasing too. There are these examples of folks who may have vulnerabilities. I don't think we really know exactly how and why it's happening, but we know that there are biological vulnerabilities towards schizophrenia and psychosis, people losing contact with reality, having hallucinations and delusions. And there are these cases where AI is sliding them into this in this very insidious kind of way. Like, oh yeah, you're right. You might be the one who's in control of the whole universe. Well, how would I know? Well, look for a sign that looks like that. And it sort of starts, kind of building on that too. And I think, these are the kinds of things that could be happening underneath the surface where a parent isn't necessarily aware of it. But I think, where I go in my initial thinking around this is having that open conversation with your son, your daughter, your child to say, look, there are these risks that are out there. And if things start heading that direction, little red flags may start going off in your head a little bit of like, this seems a little weird. I hope you come to me and I hope you trust me that we can have a conversation around this, right? We talk about, these adults who prey on kids in chat rooms and Discord and various places, right? And they kind of get their hold on kids by having blackmail and that kind of thing. Like I'll send, compromising pictures to various folks. If you tell anybody about what's going on here, the way around that is you tell your kid, like, hey, if you've gotten yourself into a situation like this, please come talk to me, right? Tell me it's not going to be your fault. There are people out there who are doing this kind of they are having these kind of interactions with kids. You're a victim in this situation, right? This isn't your fault and you're not going to be in trouble for it. And I think starting to have those conversations around AI, hopefully the kids have some self-awareness of like, wait a second, this doesn't seem quite right, right? And building that trust in that relationship so they can come to you and say like, hey, wait a second, I think I may have got myself into a bit of a hole over here. Can you kind of put me back in touch with reality a bit or help me with this problem instead of only just kind of turning to the AI tool?
Yeah, I completely agree. Just to amplify Allison's point there, I think, yes, we absolutely need more guardrails, and yet I don't know what those guardrails look like. So at this point in time, it does come down to parents, caretakers having those conversations with their kids about the risks of AI and the risks of social media and just the internet more broadly. And, when things don't feel right, that early point, right, that you just get that feeling in your stomach that this is a little bit off, having that conversation with mom, dad, whoever the caretaker may be. More broadly, when it comes to guardrails, it's just, I know it's trite to say, but it's said all the time, AI is a black box, right? We don't know what's going on under the hood. Things go off the rails all the time, and we hear a response by the company of, oh, well, we fixed the algorithm. What does that even mean? So, ultimately, it's going to come it's going to come down to more transparency. However, you have to have a lot of technological expertise, I think, to regulate that sort of thing. So, yes, we need guardrails. And, as I sit here and think about what that would look like, I struggle with it.
And I want to piggyback off of Alison and John in that, in regards to the legislative piece, so there are a couple states, I think there's 3 states right now, that if certain guardrails get hit, I guess through someone prompting or interacting with these types of AI companions, they will then send a response and shut the companion down that says you need to contact this mental health organization, and here's a phone number. But that is only regulated, to my knowledge, in 3 states. Now, what happens if they don't call? Different situation. I think of it in like the AI companion that we were testing out because somebody had asked us to test it out. I was pushing it on the mental health piece. And that AI companion spit back and said, I can't diagnose you, but I think these are signs of schizophrenia. So although it said, I can't diagnose you, it was still giving a potential diagnosis while also saying you should contact a therapist. And when that's great and that's wonderful, but I am again going to pull back to the community aspect. What if you are someone in the community, because a lot of the population I used to work with didn't have health insurance. They don't have necessarily, a phone or something that they can call someone, or who do they call, right? So at least in the states where the regulation is, they're getting a phone number, and theoretically they'd have a phone because they're talking to an AI companion. They would be able to call. But what if they don't have the resources or know how to then follow through in the states where something isn't regulated and then just gets, you should see a therapist? Well, that's great. Maybe I'm talking to you because I don't have a therapist, or I can't afford a therapist, or I don't know where to go. So in those situations, I agree with everything that you both are saying. The boundary, the guardrail piece, the boundary piece is crucial, but what happens in the community when they still don't have access to those types of services, but yet they have access to the AI because the AI is free, right? And that's like a systemic question, right? But that's what I think about when I hear, what kind of guardrails we can put in place. I think of it differently as, well, if we have the guardrails, how do we still get them help if it's an access issue?
Yeah. And that sounds like that it gets to the possibility that there is this balance, right? There's versions of this AI therapy that could be helpful in those exact cases, Jessica, but also guardrails and some limits. And I think it's fascinating that like it diagnosed you without diagnosing you. It's like, said, I can't do that. And so many cases where you see that. Now, seeing Julia emerge makes me assume that it's time for the Q&A session piece of things. Does that sound about right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're at a good point for that. Thank you all so much for what a really engaging conversation. We have about 10 questions that have started to pop up in the chat. I'm going to try to fuse some together just for the purposes of time because there are some common themes coming up. The first one that's really interesting to me is the idea of seeing a shift from an attention economy to a trust economy that better filters what we're allowing into our lives as we have AI kind of having more of an influence. No, it's a little hefty.
Yeah, I think that this is a really hard one. I mean, I think, right, the attention economy, it's because folks have been able to monetize that, right? And I have to think through kind of how one would monetize trust, right? Which I don't know, in and of itself, just saying that out loud gives me a little bit of a pause there. But I do think that I think it's actually a really great point to bring out trust here, because I do think that trust is part of the equation of what's happening and part of what's been eroded in a lot of different ways, where people don't trust the companies to give, right, tools that they feel like are going to be like to their benefit. And I'll also say too, we've got issues in the education sphere around trust and AI, where faculty aren't trusting students that they're doing their own work. Students aren't trusting faculty that they are actually the ones who are providing feedback on their work. And students don't trust one another not to get unfair advantages by using AI tools too. So I think actually it's incredibly insightful to be thinking about like how can we move from sort of using attention as the unit to be thinking about trust? Like how can we build trust? And also from where I sit too, thinking about trust and expertise. I think this is part of what has been eroded with AI is like, oh, well, we can use AI, and AI is great in many ways, but things go off the rails in all kinds of different ways too. And having experts around who can say, that's not right? That's not actually schizophrenia. This is something else. And yet culturally, there's been a bit of a decline in focus on expertise. So I in some ways, I think it's incumbent upon experts, higher education, psychologists, et cetera, to start to have this conversation around trust and trusting expertise and what is our added utility on top of AI. I'm not sure I exactly answered the question, but hopefully it was in the same domain of where the question was headed.
Yeah, I think so. And kind of going in that same direction, we've had a couple questions kind of popping up about, especially for young people, how we can really protect one another from the negative effects. We have a student kind of talking about the way that they see it around them. Another person is asking about, a clear definition of over-reliance on AI. So I guess kind of feeding into that, how can we support one another as this tool kind of has more prevalence in not only our academic work, but our work life and just kind of our daily life? How do we help one another?
I would say one suggestion, I mean, I'm kind of going off of something Alison said earlier about the 20-year-old and kind of asking for a buddy in a way that would help regulate their media time. To me, that's one way where you could have like an accountability partner essentially and say like, can you block my password, or after this amount of hours, I'm not allowed to engage in whatever tool or use that they are using, is one way. But on the flip side of that too, I wonder how many people would be willing to do that, because what I see from where I sit is a lot of stigma also attached depending on who you are using AI. So I think there's stigma, like, I don't think all faculty say the amount of AI that they potentially use because there's stigma affiliated with that. I think students don't always say how they're using it, even if they're in positive ways in both spectrums, but just that they might be perceived as not smart, or you're using this as a crutch instead of doing your work. And I think that stigma goes across all of those lines. And it's similar, to like stigma that you would see in a substance use population as well. And how do you get past that stigma piece in order to reach out to help, which in a way also reinforces why you would go to the AI companion in the first place, because you don't want the judgment that's attached to the stigma. So it's like this vicious cycle that I do not have the answer on how to break. But accountability partners, to me is a simple step in that process as well. It looked like John might want to say something, maybe not.
Well, I think part of what comes up for me is, what we're talking about here is, even though this is so new, we're talking about sort of cultural change, right? And we can regulate from the top down, absolutely, and we do that all the time, and that has effects. But some of our most lasting effects come from the bottom up, come from changes in the social norms, so to speak, right? So, how do we facilitate that, creating more spaces for conversations? We're having this conversation right now, but kind of drilling down to younger and younger years, right? Whether it's in the community, in the schools, in the home, the more conversations that we're having about the pros and cons, the risks and the benefits, I think the more opportunity we have for broader changes in the norms around AI. And I feel even strange saying norms around AI because of how new it is. But they're there, they exist. And that's going to look very different, right, across the board.
I was thinking too about the question of how can we support one another? And I think, schools have done really interesting and I think great things recently by trying to really get the devices out of the classrooms. right? So making sure that the phones are put away, not accessible. And I know there are still workarounds, right? Kids are still texting on their laptops because they have it connected up to their phone or whatever. But I think that when you talk to educators about what's going on in the schools, they notice a palpable difference, right? They said the amount of conversation happening in the cafeterias is it's qualitatively different, right? Just the nature of it, the amount of conversations happening, it's tremendously different. And so in terms of supporting one another, I think thinking about like how can we create spaces within our families, within our friend groups, where can we have this time and space away from these devices, away from the AI, to have that kind of positive pull for that, those dopamine hits that we get in interpersonal interactions, right? And so one way is to sort of present an alternative, right? Like how can we, as a group, we're going to like support each other by, let's have a conversation. Let's play a board game. Let's do, whatever else that might be, right? Let's go play sports together. Creating those spaces, it sounds quaint. I mean, the sorts of things that kids used to do in the neighborhood all the time, right? But how can we do that? And because I think some of that has been replaced by, right? Just like we talked about, like the social media replaced the interpersonal interactions. I think AI, the companionship part there is replacing some of this stuff. So we can support one another by presenting alternatives and really trying to draw each other into that and supporting each other in that.
Thank you. So I guess the last kind of common theme question is that, kind of based on the chat and based on the conversation we've had today, there's more of a consensus that this is a slippery slope to go down in using AI related for mental health purposes. So would you say, just kind of at this moment, are we at a point that this could be a helpful tool in the mental health space? And if so, what does that look like? Really quick. I know that's a wild thing to ask of you guys.
I would say, I mean, my sort of general read on all of this is I think, and folks have said, right, I talked about the social media, or sorry, social anxiety exposure kind of on-ramp there. Somebody commented, I don't think it was in the public chat, that this is also getting used with autism spectrum disorder. Folks who have autism spectrum disorder is another way to kind of coach them into social interactions. I do think that there are some narrow use cases and narrow tools where it could be very helpful, but I think this is really, we're so early in this process that these tools have not been really well developed, tested in a broad kind of sense, and people developing their own therapist with their own, chat GPT or character AI or whatever it is. I think that's the Wild West. And I would not feel comfortable recommending that to anybody.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with these narrow use cases. I see a lot of opportunity there that need to be tested. Right now, the cart is certainly before the horse in terms of the testing of these technologies and sort of narrow interventions. But there's a lot of opportunity. I see a lot of opportunity on the therapist side and the training side, right? So just real quickly, training for something like suicide risk assessment, when you're really trying to kind of practice behaviorally, that assessment. At one end of the continuum, it can be quite artificial, case examples, role plays, etc. At the other end of the continuum, it can be very real. A clinician in training is sort of thrust into that situation suddenly. I see opportunities for AI to kind of find that middle ground where a student or a trainee could really practice something like a crisis assessment or a suicide risk assessment in a setting where the consequences are negligible, right, or lacking. So from a training perspective, I see a lot of opportunity.
And I'll just throw one thing out there in both of the examples, which I agree with all of them. The human is still in the loop, right? So to me, that's the key. In any of these AI in mental health in any way, the human has to be in the loop. And I think I had said to John at some point that, even the AI companion itself, like if you had an AI companion, I could see that being in a therapy setting, as long as there were guardrails that would immediately alert like a human that would then intervene if certain flags went up, right? So you're still always keeping the human in the loop. I don't know, right now, if that's possible. I think it is possible in the ways that we're currently seeing it in therapy being tested, but moving forward, I have a 15-year-old daughter as well. I would not recommend her to use any type of AI companion for anything, actually. But if in the future there was that possibility, having the human in the loop is the only way I think it could work.
Yeah. I would just say, kind of, because I think we're at time in terms of parting, is that that this is again the AOL days of AI, and I think that's important because these tools are evolving. And just yesterday, Anthropic released a new. Well, they didn't release it. They mentioned a new model called Mythos, and they said that Mythos is so good, so powerful, that it creates so much risk that they're not comfortable actually making it available to the world. This is for security reasons and other issues that are there. And so I just say this, and that it's important to remember that today's AI is the worst AI that you're ever going to use, and that as these things adapt, just like social media is adapting or has adapted, this is the opportunity to also create whatever that next phase looks like. There are lots of positive things, but there's also, again, being on the frontier, a lot of things to be worried about as this evolves. So I think, as some might say, maybe we're not in Kansas anymore, or maybe we're not in Pallet Town in Canto or something like that. So it's just important to keep that, just keep that in mind. So I appreciate my wonderful panelists. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you, everyone who's joined.
Thank you, Jason, for leading the conversation today. Thank you, Jessica, John, and Allison. Thank you, Mike, for starting our conversation today as well. We have our exit survey here. This helps us gather with more information on what we can do as we continue the series to bring these conversations to our communities.